Kristin, welcome to the webinar. We'd love to hear a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm Kristin Clark, and as was mentioned, I'm the Chancellor of the West Hills Community College District. Prior to that, I was a president at West Hills College Lemoore, and before that, I had roles in community colleges, but I came out of the student services side, so very familiar with all of the aspects of counseling and admissions and records, financial aid, etc. So I do have a background in that. I also tend to be a little bit of an IT nerd. I do like technology and probably understand it better than a lot of my counterparts do, just because I have an affinity towards it. Our district has been using this product for about 7 years, but probably more deeply in the past several years. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today and our experience and kind of the vision that we have around using the tool today.
Lessons learned, so to speak. Things never work out perfectly right out of the gate. There can be some challenges, especially related to doing analytics, and we've talked about some of these, but you mentioned previously that bad data in can mean poor insights out. That can be a roadblock in building trust and adoption of the tool, or maybe even the strategy more broadly. Two-part question for you here, Kristin. What should other leaders prepare for around the work of working with analytics? And then the second one, what should the institutions ask and expect from the vendor partnership component of this, working towards these issues?
From the leadership perspective is really figuring out how to break down the importance of the inputs that we use, and how data is not just institutional research's responsibility, right? That we all have to be consumers of it, because it's how we measure what we're doing to ensure that it's successful. It's hard to directly correlate our holistic case management to our success rates, because that's one aspect of the work that we're doing. But over the last several years, we've had our cohort rate has continued to climb, year over year. And I don't know if it's, because we've got everybody's eyeballs on it and looking at that or not. I'd like to think so, but who knows, making sure that people are able to ask questions about it. It's not just, look, we have to think about this in a way that tools are great and tools are fantastic because they help us be more efficient. They help us do our job, but it's not a tool that gets the results. It's a collective vision and direction. Leaders have to set that vision. They have to set that momentum and that expectation so that everybody buys in. From a vendor perspective, I think it's trying to help, with the implementation guides, and resources that end users can use. We talk about quality and quality assurance, making sure that when we do have problems, our end users are documenting that appropriately so we can feed that back to the vendor. And then from a vendor perspective, being on it, making sure that they're addressing those issues. So like I always tell people, you can't just submit something and say, it doesn't work. How do I fix it? Doesn't work, right? So, it's being intentional and how problems are reported. And my first question when somebody says it's not working is, well, is it a system problem? Is it a setup problem? Is it a training problem? What is it specifically? So we could get to that. So, the vendor can help us in trying to train up our people on how to differentiate that. And then again, I think for leaders, it's just making sure that the leadership is saying this is important, and that this is kind of a very collective vision and not just another product that we're implementing, because goodness knows we have lots of those.
What my filter picked up, communication is important on the campus. Communication between the vendor and the university, college become very important. Knowing how to communicate, knowing what the pathways are, knowing what some expectations are up front. I know in our world, we spend time with our partners talking about, hey, these are the folks that you're going to want on the bus, and probably when you're going to want them on the bus based on what's going to be ahead in deployment. And hey, here's an individual on our team who's going to be walking with you through this process, and here's how this works, right? But it is a dance. It's a knowing what you need, knowing what we're able to provide, having that communication, and kind of continuing to iterate and work on it. I'm curious, Kristin, when we talk about the work and preparing leaders, one of the things we hear pretty frequently in spaces that it's working really well is there's some kind of infrastructure, like a student success council or a district enrollment management council or something like that. Have you found a place on the campus that this kind of naturally fits, that is able to support the work you're doing around data and analytics?
Yeah, so we have a team, a district-wide team, and they're our holistic case management team, and they work directly with Civitas, but they also convene to talk about training plans, rolling it out, best practices. They are meeting on a regular basis. And as a matter of fact, like, again, we had our convocation on Friday. We talked about it globally. And then there were breakout sessions with faculty and staff. And this team led all of that work. One of the other things, just to kind of go back for a second too, about making sure that you're successful, is understanding that technology and products are great because they do help us manage the work, but they're not the end all. And they're not perfect. There isn't one software out there that's going to be perfect. And we have to manage expectations. So I always use the 80-20 rule. If it helps us be efficient for 80% of our students, then we're doing really well, because then we can focus on the other 20% more individually. So I think, starting off that way is really important, just to manage everybody's expectations too about things.
I had a phrase on the campus that I was at before, which was, don't let perfect get in the way of progress. And I think that's a very common phrase. Certainly that's not my own quote, but needed to share that frequently, which is like, hey, we've got all these different things that we've never had insights into before. We can action these insights while we're working on some of this other stuff to kind of be more in the vein that we needed to for our particular institution. So we've talked a little bit about turnover has been an issue, specifically looking at leadership positions that have turned over. And those folks are people who are driving some of these strategic initiatives. So what are your strategies for addressing that leadership turnover challenge that some folks are seeing on campuses?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And there is no perfect to that, because I think every institution out there right now is struggling with that, because you get this champion, right? And they're forging ahead and everything is great. And then what happens, with a really great champion who does great work? They get promoted and they leave. It does get to be a little difficult sometimes, but I think the way that you try to leverage that or manage that is to have a wider bench, so that it's not just one human that's your one champion. You've got to have multiple champions, and then you've got to be really good about documenting. So we've started to get better about that now, where we're looking at our initiatives and how we're documenting the history of our initiatives, like where it started and who was involved and what meetings took place. And it's kind of a little narrative that we're building over time, so that if people leave, it's easy for somebody to come back and understand the history of why, right? And it's not the Kristin Clark initiative and, oh, she's gone, so okay, that's great, let's move on. But hopefully that there's some outcomes built into that too, so that people understand what the value was out of that. Leaders come in and we have our own way of doing things. So there's always risk, that you get executive leadership in particular, that they're going to have their own agendas. So you can't guarantee that won't, that you'll be able to be consistent forever if that happens. But I do think being intentional with your documentation and your historical aspect of something is really important.
If you have new executive level leadership, that documentation can go a long ways.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when new leaders come on, they're going to ask for some feedback. And if you don't have that documentation, it becomes hard to say, this is where we were, this is where we went a year later, 2 years, 3 years, we're now into the 7 years. Here's what we've seen as the benefit, right? If that's documented, we can share the gains, we can share some lessons learned, some challenges that we've overcome, and now we're pointing in a better direction. I think a lot of leaders will take that and say, hey, maybe that's not an area that I've got to focus in on. I've got some other areas as a leader that maybe need some more attention. And so,
well, they can see who participated too, right?
Right.
How many man hours were involved in that?
Right.
Yeah.
And if it's substantial, do they want to kill a project like that's been ongoing in that space? I'm curious if you've seen it, or maybe you all are doing it. I've heard a couple of folks say that instead of just having one chair or co-lead for a thing. They've thought about this turnover, and so they've said, you know what, I'm going to put co-chairs in place or co-leads in place, and that way, if a person leaves, I've got another person who's basically been walking in pathway. Is that something that you all have done at West Hills, or maybe you've heard of it all, of folks trying that process in the space that we're in right now?
Yeah. So we have that right now with that holistic case management team. We've got a lead at the district office, and then we've also got leads at the campus, and then they work collaboratively together. The hope is that not all three of them would leave at one time.
Right.
And then also having this documentation that's rolling. So my associate vice chancellor of education and student services manages that documentation and adding to that historical document. And we do that now with all of our initiatives. So it's not just our holistic case management, but we're documenting this as we go through. And it's really great. Again, like I said, you've got all of the people who participated, the faculty, the counselors, the advisors. And so let's just say 3 people did leave at one time. You could go to that document and see, well, who was participating? Is there somebody else we could tap into that's still here that can shed some light? And I think that's important to ongoing sustainability of these types of initiatives.
Again, like you said, good people come in, they do good work, they're promoted, or other opportunities come into play, or whatever it may be. And so having that institutional knowledge that is deep, and I love the analogy, wide bench, right? Having people that are there that can kind of be in the next up philosophy is certainly important. So we've discussed where you're leveraging technology to provide infrastructure for your student success strategies. You also mentioned implementation at times has been a challenge, or some of the original strategy maybe didn't pan out. Or even turnover, like we talked about at the leadership level. So based on your experience, what should leaders consider if they're troubleshooting during an implementation and change management process, or if they've even got to go into a relaunch? What should our leaders be thinking?
Yeah, well, I think as higher ed, we're really good at buying technology, but we're not so great at implementing technology. And some of that has to do with our lack of project management. And that's just because it's not our forte in higher ed. If you go into the IT world, that's something that's drilled into you. You usually have a PMP, somebody who's certified as a project manager. You have metrics that are, tracking and monitoring your progress as you implement. Here we just say, oh, you know what, Dean so-and-so, we're going to add this, you're going to leave the project, and we're going to throw this on top of your 400 things that you're doing today. Yep. So I think, we've got to be intentional when we initiate new products, new initiatives. We've got to be strategic as we outline that a little bit, and also make sure that you've got buy-in. Because if it's something, I've seen this happen a million times in my career, and I'm sensitive of it in the position and the role that I sit in, but leaders will go off to a conference and they'll see a product and they'll come back and say, oh, we should do this, and money's thrown at it, it's purchased. And then it's like, so-and-so is assigned to go do this. And you haven't gotten buy-in. And so there's a lackluster implementation at best, and there's no usage. There's, it's just not implemented. So I think when you're troubleshooting those kinds of things, you need to get to the grassroots and find out, are there people that are undermining the project? Are there people who have not bought in? Why haven't they bought in? Do we need to have a conversation about that? Yep. And again, that goes back to that 80-20 and that whole, this is not going to wash your car and make your breakfast. It's not going to be the perfection. It's not going to be every little whistle and bell that you would like, but let's talk about the things that it does have in here. And for us, for example, when we started using this on a more holistic basis, the access, I used it as a college president all the time when I was a college president. And we have a president's list that students would get on if they hit a certain GPA. And I would personally go in and send congratulation notices to students through the tool. And I could have done that just by emailing, but I intentionally did it because I wanted others to be able to see. So if somebody was in there and they saw that the student got on the president's list, they can say, hey, I saw that you got on the president's list. That's great. Congratulations. That's good news, right? It's that, like, sharing information is powerful kind of thing. And I also wanted to show that I wasn't beneath that. Like, I'm going to use the tool the same way. But when you can explain to people and kind of show them what they get out of this and how it helps them do their job better. It's that buy-in that's critical. And I mean, that's change management 101, right? And implementation to everything is buy-in is first, then being logical, methodical, in your implementation and making sure that you've managed expectations of people as far as what the product will deliver, and also managed expectations of what needs to go into it to be successful, the time commitment, etc. And then we need to free up those hours of time for people to do that work to make it successful.
Yeah. It's not a silver bullet. It's not the panacea or Pandora's box that you open and all of a sudden everything is, now I'm going to kick my feet up on the table and all is good with the world. It's helping you identify that student or that lever that you can pull, and then the really awesome work that people do on college campuses gets to go and play. You're going to go have an amazing counseling session or a great advising conversation, or that faculty mentor that you're working with now has some insights that they didn't have before that they can deepen the conversation. And so that's when the beauty of the campus and those campus relationships, or that safety net that you're talking about, really has that opportunity to shine, especially when we go back to, again, those populations on the campus that we traditionally are not seeing because we didn't have a signal or a flag that let us know that there were some concerns. I'm curious, in a relaunch or troubleshooting, you mentioned needing to go have some conversations to help somebody understand and maybe help them see how it's helpful. Is there one that you're able to share, a time maybe where there was a misunderstanding or unreasonable expectations, and then after kind of having a conversation, you saw somebody who maybe was passively aggressive, letting it die on the vine, turning into kind of a champion, or somebody who was at best maybe no longer being passive aggressive with the tool and maybe giving some support?
We had a counselor who wasn't so keen on it. And, I think it was, okay, it's just one more thing. And then I've got to go over here and I've got to post notes and this and that. This particular individual saw that they were able to get some more information as they started using it that they didn't have before, and realized how they could incorporate it into their daily work. As a matter of fact, I ended up using this person as an example of really great practice, because what she did was, when she would meet with her students in a counseling meeting, she would type in the notes, and the way you can do it in Civitas, you can actually email the student from the notes itself. So she would type in the notes with the student as they were having their conversations, and she would she asked if she could have two screens in her office. I said yes. And she had one screen she would turn towards a student, and she'd have them read the notes that she just typed up, and she'd say, does this capture our conversation? Student would say yes, and she'd say, okay, I'm going to send this to you right now so you have it in your email as a follow-up later. But it was a 2-in-1. She got to emailed the student a recap of what they just had in their conversation. So now the student had it as an artifact to go back to later, because we know we talk about telling a student you need to do this, and this, and they forget by the time, they get home. And at the same time, she was posting a note. And so when she came to tell me, she was actually very excited about what she was doing and how she was using that tool. I said, that is amazing. That is just fantastic. And I started using her as an example. I had another example of a faculty member who said, and I love this faculty member to death, when she would go into the Civitas tool, you can see how students are performing in comparison to other students in the same class. So she was able to see, for example, that, a particular student was not faring well in her course, but the students seemed to be doing well in all their other courses. Yeah. So she said, I picked up the phone and I called these other instructors and said, hey, what are you doing with this student? Because you're doing very well with them. But my class, this person or the student is struggling. And so it was a dialogue about using the tool to help a student and trying to perfect my craft, and how can I learn from my peers to do a better job to support a student. And that little piece of data that she got was a way for her to do that, where she wouldn't have known that otherwise.
Yeah, I love that. And I know, and again, the world I used to live in on the campus, leading advising teams, we would talk about if we had a student in front of us and maybe they had a D or they had an F, or they just weren't looking like they were tracking particularly well, as opposed to like, well, hold on, this student's actually doing really well in a course, and maybe they've got an A or they're tracking, above the course average. And instead of starting with the D or the F, let's start with the A and say, hey, you seem to be doing amazingly well in math. What is it that you're doing inside of math that is allowing you to be successful? And then by the time you get down to some of those grades that maybe aren't quite as good, that student is already making some connections like, oh, I've got a study group for math, or I'm going to see a tutor for math. I'm not doing that in those other courses. Maybe I ought to do some of that, right? So there's some way to take that data too and really lean into the things that they're doing well so they can take that success and then spiral that success up in other spaces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It changes the
remarkable.
conversation, right? And the
Yep.
conversation now is much more robust.
Well, Kristin, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for spending time with us today in this webinar. I know it's likely incredibly busy as you get ready for classes to begin and all of the things that come with a new semester. Thank you for your time.
Yes. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.